that dives into content at the intersection of healthcare and technology. We are so pleased to have you all with us today. My name is Katrina Gagne. I'm the outreach specialist at MiHIN and the facilitator for today's download. I'm joined by Tracy Webb, our outreach manager, who is going to be our WebEx chat moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to just go over some logistics. This session is being recorded and will be available on MiHIN's website after today's meeting. All attendees have been muted upon entry. We're so pleased to have had over 200 people register for today's webinar. So to ensure good audio throughout, please remain muted. We encourage your participation by using the WebEx chat. Please feel free to ask questions and make comments throughout the presentations. We definitely want to hear from you. Once our presenters are finished with their segment, they're going to respond to your questions via chat. And if they don't get to answer them all via chat, then Tracy, our moderator, is going to bring them up at the end of the webinar where we have some time allocated for Q&A. So if we don't get to answer all of your questions during that time, we plan to close the loop with an email that we're going to send to all attendees so that everybody can see all of the questions that were asked and all of the answers that were unanswered during the webinar. I also want to point out that the WebEx chat is located on the right side of your screen, so be sure, please, to notice the drop-down menu with options for who can view your message. Okay, so let's get started. I just wanted to provide a little bit of background. I'm sure this is a reminder to most of you about who MiHIN is, what we are. So we are a network for sharing health information statewide for Michigan. Our mission is to continuously improve healthcare quality, efficiency, and patient safety by promoting secure electronic exchange of health information. MiHIN's success comes from 5 focus areas of work. We convene people, our stakeholders, in order to listen, learn, and get feedback on functional solutions. We partner with stakeholders and champion statewide use cases or data sharing scenarios that get various types of healthcare data flowing from providers to the health information network and then out to all parties who have active care relationships. We also operate shared services among the participants of the HIN, and that includes the behind-the-scenes infrastructure for network participants to easily share information across the state. We also provide tools such as My Gateway, Viper, direct secure messaging, and transitions of care viewer to support daily workflow and coordination. And finally, we provide reports, conformance standards for data, and analytics from data lakes and the longitudinal record. So that was just a little bit about MiHIN. Today, we have a great agenda. And next up, I am going to introduce Shreya Patel. She is our Chief Policy and Privacy Officer, and she's going to be telling you about the work of the Information Blocking Task Force that was recently stood up here at MiHIN to address compliance with the ONC's final interoperability rule and how that is going to affect the work that we do with our stakeholders. Then Bo Bornacki, MiHIN's corporate account executive, is going to tell you about MiHIN's new FHIR-enabled platform called the Interop Station. And that's been designed to provide health information exchange functionality that is required by the interoperability final rule. Then James Noland is going to provide an overview of some changes that have taken place with our care coordination data display solution. James is our senior product manager for several of our products, so we're happy to hear from him on those changes. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with a few announcements, and then we'll end our session for today. So without further ado, I want to introduce Shreya Patel.
All right, good morning, everyone. As Katrina mentioned, this is Shreya Patel. I am the Chief Policy and Privacy Officer at MiHIN, and today I'm going to be discussing the information blocking task force that we've created, including a few updates on what we are doing to comply and what the effect on stakeholders will be. I know that this was identified as one of the key areas of interest at the last download meeting, but I also know that for a lot of our Michigan stakeholders in particular, that they've heard us discuss this at length. So I will start with some initial review, but then I'm going to really try and move on to newer content and updates. So as most of you are well aware, earlier this year, the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, or the ONC, released their final interoperability rule, which contained many different provisions. But one of the ones that received the most attention and kind of prompted the industry to dub the rule the information blocking rule was this requirement that certain players in the healthcare space were not able to information block. So the three groups that the ONC identified for compliance were healthcare providers, which was interpreted very broadly, health information exchanges and health information networks like us, and then certified health IT developers under a voluntary program called the ONC Health IT Certification Program. So initially, these three actors had until November 2nd to come up with a plan, which would have been Monday of this week. But in the middle of last week, the ONC released a rule which extended the deadline to April 5th, 2021. So while this is still going to be very much so a timely topic, they've given people a little more time to really figure out what their game plan is going to be. And just on this slide, before we move on, what MiHIN did to comply with the rule is we created this internal information blocking task force, and the work that the task force did over the last few months is really going to make up the remainder of the presentation. So I'm going to go into detail on what participation looks like, what our objectives were, what our timeline was, and then how all of that may change or shift a little bit now with the extension. So just to kick things off, I've listed the individuals that participated in the task force with their respective areas of expertise. And as you can see, we took a very multidisciplinary approach when putting together this group because we realized that a compliance plan would not just really impact one department like legal, for instance. Instead, it was really going to require coordination and maintenance from departments all across our organization. So we had policy and privacy, technology, security, application support, legal, product strategy, communications, business development, and technical resources all sit on the task force and kind of inform the work that we were going to do moving forward. So before the task force began work, we identified a few key objectives that we hope to accomplish based on feedback from our stakeholders and what we felt were some proactive measures to follow industry best practices. So from the internal side, we wanted to establish a data management policy where we could speak to the way that we shared or in very few instances did not share information based on applicable exceptions to the rule. And then we also wanted to create a plan to really enforce, maintain, and train our MiHIN staff on what this would mean for our work so that everyone could, really understand how this impacted us and could speak intelligently to that. Externally, we knew that we wanted to make some changes that would help provide clarity to our stakeholders and in Michigan and beyond. So we outlined how individuals could work with their providers to request their own healthcare information and make that publicly available on our website. We worked on creating this consumer-facing privacy policy where we went into detail on how we were able to share information and in which instances individuals could opt out and how that process worked. And then lastly, we worked with our marketing and communications team as well as our legal department to figure out how to publish more information on our website on how we plan to comply with the rule, which ultimately will be a separate tab that all of you on the call will be able to access. So before the group met, we created a plan of action that would guide our agenda over the last 2 months. And this includes reviewing the ONC and CMS rules and resources on information blocking, taking a close look at business risk and scope for a health information network, and identifying any risk mitigators that existed. And I've listed a few items under each of those topics for your reference, but the key takeaway to note here is the fact that we are a health information network whose purpose is to share and promote the sharing of health information for appropriate purposes. And kind of going hand in hand with that, we were already fairly well positioned for the rule. So where most of the effort was really going to come in is when we wanted to document our practices for sharing in a more formalized manner, and when we really wanted to take a closer look at ensuring that everything was very fair across our stakeholders by using things like standard interfaces, documents, and APIs. Moving on to the bulk of the work, we created a risk management model where we would be able to minimize the risk of blocking allegations. And we did this by examining any instances where we chose to not share information for valid reasons and assessing those and assessing if our rationale would really align with the guardrails that were set in place with the ONC exceptions. But we didn't just stop at examining instances where we wouldn't share information. We also tried to determine business opportunities and examine what else we could do. So we thought about new use cases that we could offer and how we could kind of promote our existing services and products. So again, this work was not just about saying, no, we will not share information in certain instances, but also examining how we could share more if that made sense to us and to our customers as well. Also, in our task force plan of action, we discussed data access and release of information policies and really determined if any changes were needed to be made to our contracts and agreements. So I know that this was a concern for some of our stakeholders, so I did just want to give an update that at this time, there's nothing in our legal agreements that would really need to change. Instead, most of the changes are going to be in our internal policies and procedures. So in that regard, it's going to have a very little effect on stakeholders just when it comes to that one component. But one more thing to touch on this slide is that we did also discuss how to best disseminate this information to our MiHIN staff and communicate the work outward, which again included creating a tab on our website where you'd really be able to find the bulk of this information. So transparency was definitely something that we worked on a lot internally on the task force and something that we're going to make sure to emphasize over the next few months for everyone as well. So I know that I walked through our entire action plan, but there were a few components of it that were worth emphasizing for this group, and that is kind of what our internal compliance plan looks like, particularly in respect to our data management policy. And it's worth noting that there definitely are some very big misconceptions about the information blocking rule, where individuals think that the point of the rule is to get organizations to share more information overall. But that statement on its own can be very misleading because the ONC has said that the point of the rule is not to just say share everything and share always, but the point is really to analyze that if you as an organization have the ability to share information, determine if you do share in line with that ability, and if you do not share, kind of determine if you do have one of those predefined exceptions for that. And then kind of part two of that analysis is to really ensure that we're sharing information or using exceptions in a really non-discriminatory manner so that it results in organizations trying to cooperate at this point instead of compete with one another when it comes into health information exchange. I've touched on this a bit too, but our new consumer-facing privacy policy is also going to be something to emphasize because we receive a lot of questions on things like opt-out and patient right of access. In fact, I think that we received a few questions about that at our last download meeting. So just to circle back on opt-out, the goal was for the Information Blocking Task Force to really provide clarity for healthcare consumers. So we discussed things like the authority for sharing information, which was largely based on the HIPAA privacy rule, which allows for sharing for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. We also discussed in which instances that we might need patient consent to share specially protected information for things like substance use disorder information coming from Part 2 facilities. We discussed when individuals are able to opt out of certain use cases and then what the process for opt-out actually looks like. And then we also even went further to clarify what opt-out actually means for a particular use case. So for example, with our virtual integrated patient record, opt-out doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to go ahead and delete all the information from your record, but instead it means that we're going to make sure that all of your information is hidden completely so that no one can view it or access it from our system. So really making sure that individuals understand how their information is being used and protected, and that was really the main focus of that initiative. Lastly, I just wanted to circle back on what the effect on our stakeholders would be. So I know that there may be an interest in the rule beyond just an interest on how us at MiHIN are handling it. For example, organizations on this call may be wondering what they need to do to comply if they're a healthcare provider. And one thing that we did want to note is that healthcare providers under this rule do have a different standard of care than health information networks have, and they also have different penalties. So where health information networks have the standard of care where they either know or they should have known about information blocking violations, providers need to actually have actual knowledge that they are actively information blocking. So in a lot of ways, there are more stringent requirements on HIEs and HINs, and that's for good reason. But one more kind of component that goes along with that is even if there is a claim against healthcare providers, those claims and those penalties are going to look really different than the penalties to health information networks. So for example, health information networks can face up to $1 million in civil monetary penalties, but the penalties for providers have not yet been defined by the Office of the Inspector General. And they've stated that will very likely take the form of CMS disincentives instead of, hitting them with these large monetary penalties the way that these larger organizations that facilitate health information exchange might face. So if you are a provider subject to the rule, the one thing that I do want to reiterate is, I've kind of outlined today what our interpretation and what our stance has been on it from the Health Information Network level, but that might be a little bit different than what your organization should be doing in order to comply and what standard of care that you may need to take in order to comply. So we're always available to answer any questions on some of those distinctions, but we just wanted to kind of point that out on this call. But when it comes to your use cases or your health exchange with MiHIN, just know that generally speaking, much is not going to change from how it's functioning today. So we have always attempted to follow industry best practices and share information when it promoted things like public health. We've always tried to collaborate with other organizations and make sure that our practices are done in a very non-discriminatory manner. So it is very likely that many of our stakeholders and many people on the call aren't even really going to notice a lot of these changes that we've been making internally. However, the purpose of sharing all this out today is because we felt it was really important to be transparent on what we were doing internally to comply and just answer any outstanding questions that anyone may have. So that concludes my presentation for today. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function, and I can be sure to kind of answer some of those questions as the webinar continues, but I know that we can also follow up at the end of all the presentations for today as well, if I'm unable to get to all of them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bo Bernacki with MiHIN to discuss interoperability.
All right, thank you, Shreya. So this is Bo Bernacki. Today we are going to talk about the interop station. Next slide. So as Shreya alluded to, the 21st Century Cures Act mandated to CMS and ONC to draft up some final rules called the Interoperability and Patient Access Final Rules. The CMS side produced kind of the what, including what the functional and business requirements are, what they wanted to see. And again, this applies to payers only at this time with CMS populations. The ONC flavor of the final rule had to do with the how, so the technical specs and formulations there. The sneak peek there is that they want us to use FHIR, right? Next slide. So in terms of timelines, the initial priorities for payers is going to be the Patient Access API that was originally due on January 1st of this coming year, 21. But since COVID and some issues there, they pushed it back by 6 months to June. So the Patient Access API requires that a patient be able to use any third-party app of their choice to query their payer and retrieve all data that that payer has on them, clinical claims, everything. So this is a huge piece of legislation to step forward. The other component of the final rule is the Provider Directory API. That's also due next year in June. So you have to be able to query the payer and get certain information about the providers that are in network there. A little later in the timeline, we have the payer-to-payer data exchange in 2022. Just like it sounds, this allows payers to exchange data with each other as patients move between plans and so on. And then finally, the dual eligible experience. That has to do with federal state exchanges. Again, that is later in 2022 as well. Next slide. So this is a slide from the ONC, and this is really just to highlight that we are still in the infrastructure or architecture phase of the technical and policy components here. This legislation is designed to build that ground floor that we can build upon to achieve the real public health and health outcomes we want to see in the future. Next slide. So we designed the interop station first and foremost to satisfy some of these rules on behalf of our payer partners here, but we're moving beyond that and building it in a modular fashion that will allow us to go beyond that. So we're going to start with kind of the check the box functionality with the Patient Access API, Provider Directory, etc. But there's a whole bevy of, for example, Da Vinci use cases that are FHIR enabled, and then quality measures and HEDIS applications to this, and then SDOH with the Gravity project has been kind of a hot button, and other public health applications. So we really are designing this from the beginning to be a FHIR-enabled platform that can support multiple additional functionalities beyond just what's required in the legislation. Next slide. So a big part of what we do for the IO station is the data mapping and transformation. So step one, when we work with a payer partner here who has decided to implement the IO station at their location, we have to dive into that payer's inner workings in terms of how they store both clinical and claims data. They usually have different vendors and claims systems and EOB and pharmacy and all of that. And we need to extract all of that in whatever format they can produce it in, which is often a proprietary or quasi-standard kind of format. And then we need to translate that into FHIR resources. And so that is a huge lift that we do. And then we put that into a cohesive database environment that can then be accessed by the various API calls that start to come in when we go to production. Next slide. So in the simplest view, this is what the interop station is. The left here shows the kind of point of entry here. So we have the developer portal. So when these third-party phone app developers want to come in, they have this portal that walks them through those steps. They have to submit security and privacy attestations, and those need to be reviewed. And then if those pass, they're granted access to the production API. We have the digital witness service, and this is essentially a very advanced audit logger that will record all incoming API call requests, record which ones were accepted, which ones were rejected, and why, and a timestamp. And this is very critical as we move down the line. If there are any accusations or issues about data blocking or information blocking, we have that kind of solid ledger that has that paper trail to talk about that. The middle kind of represents the cohesive FHIR-enabled database. And then on the right, you have all those different kinds of data sources coming in, being translated into FHIR and then populated into that FHIR environment, which is then accessed by that front door of all these different types of APIs. Next slide. So this is just an example. I believe this is CareConvene of a third-party phone vendor app that a patient could potentially choose. There are dozens of these apps being developed as we speak that want to communicate with different payers' API systems. And it's really up to that developer on how they want to organize and store the data, because when they receive that patient access API response, it is literally all the clinical and all the claims data that the payer has on the patient. So it's quite a bit. And it's up to the apps to determine how to display that in a sensical and user-friendly way. Next slide. So in summary, we designed this interop station to be flexible and modular. We can add on additional components that are beyond what the final rule requires. So for example, several payers have mentioned, of course, quality measures and HEDIS, right? Why don't we take advantage of the fact that we have all of our data now, clinical and claims, in one location and in one format? That has kind of never been done before, and it opens up a lot of opportunities to take advantage of. Let's reuse our investments. Let's build upon the work that we've done as a stakeholder community for the past 10 years, getting all this data set up through MiHIN and moving through the Health Information Network. And let's take advantage of that as we kind of move to this next phase of the interop station. And ultimately, this can serve as a highway to interoperability. So again, when you have all the data in a cohesive, secure location in one format, that really opens a lot of doors to interoperability and different use cases coming in. We can query for SDOH data and facilitate that, etc. So this really is some excellent architecture that is, future-proof with the fact that it's FHIR and can really provide that boost to interoperability in our state. So although the rules are specifically applicable to payers right now, some think that CMS may eventually move to the clinical side, but either way, having this FHIR-enabled front door is not exclusive to payers. If there are clinical organizations out there, health systems, POs, that would see a benefit of having a FHIR-enabled front door and having their data translated into FHIR, we're certainly open to helping with that. Next slide. So that was a very quick high-level overview of the interop station, but feel free to reach out to me either via email or type your question in the chat, and we'd be happy to answer them. So next, I will be passing to James Noland, who has some announcements about My Gateway.
Good morning, everybody. So for today's discussion, we also wanted to sort of provide a little bit of an update about My Gateway, which some people on this call might know or understand as Mitigate. So I wanted to provide a quick update there around that name change and some of the features that will be available. So My Gateway, which stands for Medical Information Gateway, is MiHIN's sort of single, consistent, interoperable solution for managing health information. And in order to streamline all the workflows that folks have around accessing that information and efforts to improve care coordination and ultimately enhance the quality of care that folks are able to provide to their patients. There are a number of different portals that are modules that exist inside of the My Gateway application that folks can use to view different things about their patient or interact with the data that's available about their patient. And that list of sort of the current available modules is there on the right-hand side. One of the things that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail here this morning is the fact that we've now created the ability for users to have single sign-on access into the longitudinal record, so that information is sort of consolidated under that My Gateway umbrella. So why did we make the name change? We changed the name from Mitigate to My Gateway, and sort of the first and foremost, we wanted to have a sort of name that is more representative of the functionality that we're making available through the application. So really being that gateway into information available about patients. Overall, we're sort of increasingly making strides to integrate all of the legacy GLHC products that existed within the Solution Center and legacy MiHIN products that have existed under the old sort of Mitigate umbrella. And as we continue to combine that functionality together, we wanted a name that was representative of that sort of new global solution. So we felt it was important to make that change so that folks could really have a place to identify with the combined solution strategy. We also recently sort of tied Viper and the longitudinal record more closely with the information that was previously available in Mitigate. So as we're making that change, it felt like a good time to create and provide a name that really reflected that new direction of the product. So we've also, along with the name change, have recently sort of deployed some new features to My Gateway, specifically to some of the modules within My Gateway, and namely the Transitions of Care Viewer. And we're really excited about those changes because we think it provides access to not only access to additional information, but also different ways to sort of make sure that we're able to find the patients that people care about most and really use the tool to narrow down the sort of vast amounts of information people have to deal with on a regular basis to really hone in on the folks that care about most. So those changes are being able to access, like we mentioned, that single sign-on access from My Gateway to the longitudinal record that exists in Viper for a patient. And that can be accessed directly from the Transitions of Care Viewer through an easy-to-use button that exists there that will take you directly to that patient's longitudinal record. And we've also implemented a feature where users can filter down the encounters that show up in the TOC viewer based off of the chronic condition or chronic disease identified in those messages based off of the diagnosis codes that are there and available, or that come with the message itself. So this makes it easier to identify if you're focused on a particular chronic condition or want to focus in on your patient population that has a particular chronic condition. You can really easily find those patients or find those particular encounters through that easy-to-use filter. And we'll be continuing to expand that filter to accommodate other chronic conditions and to also include other attributes that we'll be collecting for patients that make it easier to identify those sort of subsets of populations. So one of the questions I think folks had was when will Viper or when will that longitudinal record access be available to all customers using My Gateway? As I mentioned, currently it's available today from the Transitions of Care Viewer. We're also working on making that available from the patient-centered view that you can access by clicking on a patient's name anywhere in My Gateway. So that'll also take you in the coming months. That'll also be able to take you directly to that person's longitudinal record. So they're overall, we're really excited about the direction of the product, and we're really excited about those new features that are available. If folks have any questions, we've got the contact information listed for our account executives here as well.
Thanks so much, James. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, if you are interested in learning more or having a demo of My Gateway, please reach out to your region's account executive here at MiHIN. They're all shown here. Our account executives can also provide you with detailed information about use cases and really all the products and services offered by MiHIN. So be sure to jot down their contact information and reach out directly when you need to. And just for everybody's information, this slide deck will be made available on MiHIN's website. So you can easily access their contact information from there. All right, so now is time for Q&A. I know that we've received some questions through the chat. I'm not sure if all of them have been answered, but Tracy, can you help guide us through those questions?
Sure, yeah. You have a couple that have gone through the chat, and it looks like the team is responding to those accordingly in chat, but we've got a couple of others as well. Can you share the information or website location where third-party vendors can begin the process to access the data into the Interop station? Not sure who best to answer that one.
Yeah, so this is Bo. That is going to become available as each payer's interop station goes live. So each interop station will be unique to that particular payer. They control the data, it's their data. And then the developer console, which is that path to production, will open up individually with each payer, right? So you, if you want to touch base with me offline, we can talk about which payers are going to be coming online and how you would get into that application process. But the starting point will be those payers' websites, and they will have links and instructions for vendors that want to participate and how to kick that off.
Great. Thank you, Bo. Katrina, that's all the questions that we have unanswered at this time. If you haven't had your questions responded to, please just ensure that you are sending the question to everyone in the group instead of just the moderator, because I can't see all of those. So if you have one that you've asked and haven't gotten a response to yet, just make sure that you put that in to everyone, please.
So there was another one that came in through chat that asked if MDHHS is a payer. I assume that's engaged with the interop station. So we're currently in discussions with MDHHS and reviewing options of how they want to implement and comply with the final rules, but nothing definitive at this time.
Thanks, Bo. Looks like we have a few other questions coming in. Tracy, can you see those?
Yeah, one just came in too. What's the differences between My Gateway and the Interop station?
So My Gateway is a web-based application that folks can use to log in to view information about the patients that they have an active care relationship service or active care relationship with. And the Interop station is the solution that's being developed specifically to resolve the requirements associated with the 21st Century Cures and Interoperability Final Rule. So they're two different tools for sort of two different purposes, but still both are providing access to patient information.
Thank you, James. We have one more. Substance use disorder provider generated information still completely outside of, quote, transition of care viewer due to Michigan's current interpretations of 42 CFR today. Is there progress towards secure, consented information being accessible in the TOC viewer?
Yeah, this is Shreya. I can start with this answer, and then James or Bo, feel free to jump in if you think I missed anything. But I think that this can kind of be answered in two parts, and that's based around how we are interpreting 42 CFR Part 2. MiHIN does receive substance use disorder information currently from non-Part 2 facilities, in which case patient consent is not required, and they're able to share that information in the same way that physical health information is being sent. Where 42 CFR Part 2 comes into play from our perspective is when we're actually receiving sensitive information from Part 2 defined facilities. And currently, no Part 2 facilities are sending us any of that information. So this is something that we are currently working with our product manager, Kim Bashel, there on developing a solution for, and it's called our electronic consent management system, in which case we can work with Part 2 facilities to receive that information and then use that information in that manner. But my thought is right now we're not receiving the Part 2 protected information, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not displaying any substance use disorder information that we are receiving properly under HIPAA.
Yeah, and if we are receiving it properly under HIPAA, it will be available in the transitions of care viewer for those patients.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, James, for that response. We just have a few minutes left and a few announcements I need to make. So we are going to answer the last questions from Chris and Diana via an email to everybody after our meeting today. You can expect that within the next couple of days. So again, thank you so much to all of our presenters for all of the great information. So, okay, just a few announcements. If you have not already seen it, the interface, MiHIN's newsletter, was emailed out yesterday. So please be sure to check your inbox for content related to the presentations today. There's more information in the newsletter about everything that was presented. Plus, there's even more. So check your inbox, and then if you haven't subscribed yet to receive it, you can do so at mihin.org/the-interface. One article that I wanted to point out that's in there is about MiHIN's accelerated effort to onboard organizations to the enhanced social determinant of health use case, given the elevated need for integrated care coordination during this pandemic that we're facing. So the use case was enhanced recently, and it enables integration with ACRES for information sharing with the active care team via MyGateway. So if you're interested in learning more, read the article, and you can also reach out to me for more information. Also, you're going to find information about a notice that we sent out about Beaumont Health having integrated or upgraded their lab information system. And the change is going to cause some changes to the format of the labs being delivered to the statewide lab use case participants. Again, more information in the interface. And lastly, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services will host their Health IT Commission meeting on November 17th. The public is welcome to attend. It's a virtual meeting, and Shreya and Bo will actually be presenting there again. You can find more information by Googling Michigan Health IT Commission or going to the website. That's kind of difficult to type in there. So then lastly, we welcome you to attend, to register and attend our next download, which will be Tuesday, December 1st. Keep your eye open for a email from us to register for that. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today and wish you all a safe and productive rest of your week. Goodbye until next time. Thanks, everyone.